Tonight's program marks a kind of a sad part of the Detroit area's history, but still an important one. In the summer of 1967, Detroit experienced really the worst racially charged civil disturbance in the United States up to that time. Years of frustration generated by entrenched and institutionalized racism paled over, on a late July night, an event that some call a riot, others call rebellion, uprising, or insurrection, with thousands of African Americans and others taking the street for several days of looting, arson, and gunfire. And law enforcement was overwhelmed, as you may recall, until many of you won't recall that. I was only 11 years old, but until the National Guard came in. And this book, Detroit 67, Origins, Impacts, and Legacy, draws on the memories, facts, and analysis gathered together to create a broad context of the information going back 50 years from there and now 50 years forward. And the editor of the book, Joel Stone, is with us tonight. Joel is Senior Curator for the Detroit Historical Society. Joe oversees the Detroit Historical Museum, the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, and the 250,000 artifacts in the City of Detroit's historical collections. Raised in the Detroit area, we were just talking about that, he grew up here in the Grosse Pointe. He studied journalism, history, archaeology, and archival management, University of Detroit, Wayne State, and the University College of Cork, Ireland. He supports a number of regional organizations and is a board member of the Association of Great Lakes Maritime History. This is his second Bicknell presentation. He previously presented a program for us relating to his book, Border Crossings of the Detroit River Region in the War of 1812. His other books include Interpreting Maritime History at Museums and Historic Sites, Revolutionary Detroit, Portraits in Political and Cultural Change, 1760 to 1805, and his most recent book, Floating Palaces of the Great Lakes, A History of Passenger Steamships on the Inland Seas. Joel, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I like to say that I was born on the west side, I grew up on the east side, now I live on the north side and work on the south side. So
There you go.
I try to have it all covered. I grew up just down Fairholme, right after it goes around the curve here. I used to drive by, run my bike, right by this building in its old spot on my way to food fair, past Howard Johnson's on the way to the library. Yeah, I remember this building. We've got a few new things going on. 67 is probably the biggest, and it's done incredible things for our attendance. It's done incredible things for our profile nationally, internationally. I was just talking with a German journalist the other day. People are interested in this story all over. People from Paris call, wanting to know how we did it, what we're doing. And it's a pretty cool story. A couple of the other things we've got going in our changing gallery, we've got a community gallery that we allow 501c3s of just about any stripe to use. From the Humane Society to the Boy Scouts, right now University of Michigan Foundation is in there because of course they're celebrating their 200th anniversary. It's going to be followed pretty quickly by Selfridge Air Force Base, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary. So there's pretty cool stuff going down on there, besides the streets of Old Detroit, which everybody remembers and likes talking about. 67, everybody's got a story. We were talking about your dad and your mom, and most people remember it. It's something that as a curator, it's a pretty darn important thing, and it's pretty darn cool because it's one of those things for Detroiters that's like the day Kennedy was shot or 9/11. You just remember where you were. You remember what was going on. So from a historical standpoint, that makes my job a whole lot easier and also a whole lot tougher because everybody remembers something different. And we're gonna discuss that, but I'll go quickly just to start on a lighter note. My story, I was 12. I was at CYO camp up in Port Sanilac. I missed the whole thing. I got home, my friends were telling me about machine gun nests on the top of the Woods Theater and tanks going by, and I missed the tanks, I missed the machine guns. That was my take on 67 for many years, until I got older and I figured out what it had done to our city. And, oh yes. And a lot of people consider 67 the turning point in Detroit. And the book argues that there were a lot of things going on in Detroit for 150, 200 years before that we have to take into account when we get to 67 to put it in perspective. And there's things that have happened since that have changed the city too. So was it absolutely the turning point? Did everything change that week in July? You got to write a book. Sorry.
Well, or listen for another hour.
Right? Or listen, yeah, another 35 minutes. I promised to try to fly through this. It became a really important project for the Victoria Historical Society, and I'm really grateful that Bob Burry and our board of directors, board of trustees, all the management got together and they embraced the project. They really took it to heart, and it became a major project for us. Kind of a problem for some people. We got a little bit of pushback from the Visitor and Convention Bureau. They wanted to know why we were going to itch that scab, why we were going to pull at that. To which we had two answers. One, why do you think there was a scab in the first place? And secondly, are you sure there's a scab? There's a whole lot of people in this town that still think there's an open sword. And if you talk to them, they take it pretty seriously. So putting that into perspective, this was something we needed to attack. When I started with the society about 11 years ago, we were coming up on the 40th anniversary, and we suggested we do something then. Newark, who had a riot rebellion the week before ours, was doing something for the 40th anniversary, and it came to our attention. We thought, should we do it? And we thought, 9 months isn't enough time. If we're going to do it, we got to do it right, and it's going to take us a while. Besides, we had just a couple of years before taken over the assets of the city's historical commission. We were still getting the wheels under the bus. We realized that the museums needed some pretty hefty work, so we renovated both museums, got them up to speed, got our budget, balanced and firm, and then we decided to attack this project. And we came up with the idea, in fact, Bob Burry labeled it, looking back to move forward. And it kind of got us out of our comfort zone, particularly me as a historian. Historians look back, that's our job. To identify potholes, advantages, things you could do to help guide the future, either around the potholes or toward the advantages. But to actually look forward in an exhibit, and that's kind of where we started, was with an exhibit, because we're a museum, we realized that we were going to be getting into some uncharted territory, but we needed to do that because with all the wonderful things that are being said about the city, all the great press that we're getting, and literally people from around the country, around the world are calling us every week, so that there's real interest here. We had to get people on board to say, this is wonderful, this is great, we're not done, it's not all fixed. And if you really want it to be better, get on board, help us with it. Help us look forward and try to fix this. So, with our mind on an exhibit, the first thing we realized we had to do was create a narrative. Okay, white kid from Grosse Pointe can't tell the story alone. Just flat out. So we needed to figure out a way to do that. Develop as many voices into this as possible. We had to inform that discussion and get the discussion started. That one of the most important parts of this project are getting people talking about it. Because people, frankly, across racial lines, across dinner tables, they don't necessarily want to talk about this. They want to leave it in the past and let's move on. Well, you can't leave it in the past till it's fixed. So we need to get the discussion informed and have people talking about it. And then we had to develop an exhibition. There's myself and Tracy Irwin and 2 people kind of in charge of making that happen. So with our whole team, our development team, our PR team, everybody, we once a week started getting together and having these discussions 3 years ago to make this happen. And we basically put together a plan. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. I will talk about exactly what happened because everybody's really kind of curious. You've read different things, you may have questions, I'm happy to try to answer those. But getting people in the room and talking was our very first thing. And the first thing I did as an academician is get other academics in the room. Called all the people I knew at all the universities in the area, and even University of New York and Northwestern University, and got these people who talk about this stuff, specifically about Detroit, and got them together and said, help me out. Tell me what needs to be in this exhibit. Tell me what I can't miss. Tell me where the landmines are. Because, racially charged as this is, there were going to be landmines, no question about it. So we got those guys together, and we did the whiteboard thing for a couple of sessions, and really had a pretty good handle on what direction we were going. But then we turned to folks in the business community, got them into the room and had them tell us what they thought needed to be there. Went out into the communities, people from the churches, people from the grassroots organizations that are having really tough conversations, and got them into the room and said, oh yeah, tell us what we need to say. And we started getting these voices together, and really everybody pretty much had the same idea. They were all going in the same direction, and really helped us define what the exhibit was going to turn out to be. We also then started an oral history project, and this was probably the, I'm really proud of the exhibit, but the oral history project is the thing that's going to go down in history as being the biggest part of this project. And we started a project that, first we went out with video cameras, and we got the Dennis Archers and the Joe Hudsons and all the people that got Roman Gribbs before he passed. We needed to get out and get a lot of those people. But then we went out just with regular, and I call them tape recorders, but of course they're digital devices. And we got a team of interns on board, taught them how to do proper oral histories. It was a good way to do it, and a wrong way to do it. Taught them how to do it, and they started doing it, and they started processing this stuff. And we're up over 525 now. Biggest project before this was one done in Rutgers. They had 85. That was a major project based on the insurrections of '67. We're up over 525, and that really helped define the voices in the exhibit. One of the things we did, well, I should have mentioned as I went through the partners, everybody from the Dingles to the Conyers to the Joe Hudsons to the Damon Keiths. We got lots of individuals involved in this. We also got lots of organizations, the Arab American Museum, the Charles Wright Museum, the DIA, the Detroit Symphony, New Detroit, Focus, Hope, all the people who were doing that kind of work, we got them into the room and talking about it. And on board as partners, we've got over 100 partners in the project, and they're all doing other stuff, which is pretty cool. I mean, the Symphony commissioned a piece about '67. The DIA and the Charles Wright right now have other exhibits going on. The Walter Reuther has an exhibit going on. The Detroit Artist Market just had one. MoCAD just opened one. There's a whole movement within the city that's addressing this, and in all kinds of different ways, which I think is wonderful. We then, with the oral history, it was the first thing you got to on our webpage. Everybody saw it. We weren't hiding this. We got it out in people's faces, and then if you clicked on there, you went to Detroit 1967. We also got 313-885-1967 as a phone number to call. And people could call in. We gave them many options. You could write a letter with your oral history. You could get on and leave it electronically. You could call the phone number. You could call up and let us know you want to talk to one of our guys, and we'd send them out or have you into the museum, and they'll take your oral history. And the oral histories were wonderful. We were getting them from the cops, the National Guard, the people who were working in the hospitals, the people who were looting, the people who were pulling people out of burning buildings, the people who were in the burning buildings. Stories from across the people like your dad, who was a photographer with one of the TV stations, and he worked 3 days in a row. People in the hospitals, 4 or 5 days in a row. Firemen, cops. I mean, this was a major event for people.
I don't think he had a choice. He couldn't come. He was in TV too and filmed on building Saks Fifth Avenue across the street, and they piled later they put those steel shutters on the windows. That was Channel 56 for many years, but they couldn't get out of the building. They had props up against all the windows, so I don't know if he had a choice by
whether he could.
Yeah. But anyway.
Frankly, we got stories of people who were sightseers. They got in their car and they wanted to head into Detroit to see the riot. And they got on the freeway and realized what was going on, and they turned around and went the wrong way on the freeway to get out as fast as possible. An incredible number of stories, and the best part is that in doing an oral history right, and we tell you how to do it, there's an oral history field kit. If you want to do it, we got churches on board. They wanted to do their own oral histories, and while they were doing that, they'd ask people about '67, and they'd give us that portion of it. To do an oral history right, you've got to not only record it and sit down and shut up. Okay, the worst oral histories are the one where the guy with the recording is talking more than the person you want to hear from. So doing that is important, but once you got it, you've got to do a transcription. Because who knows in 100 years what we're going to be, what kind of devices we're going to be listening to these things on. But if you got a transcription and it's printed out and it's stored someplace, you can pull it out and you can read it. All you need is a sun, okay? And maybe a pair of glasses if you're me. But that's what a real oral history is, and getting all these things out there on our website, stored in our digital collection, and available to people. It's been really cool because playwrights have used them, poets have been using them. If you've seen the movie 12th and Claremont, 75% of the dialogue in that movie is our oral histories. And so lots of people have been picking this up. The Free Press during the anniversary week, we're running our oral histories and discussing them with people. It's been a really wonderful resource for other people in the community. We also are in our exhibit all over the place. While I had those academicians in the room and I was stretching their ears about what I needed to know, I realized that if all of these experts, an expert on the Underground Railroad, an expert on Detroit in the 1880s, Black Detroit in the 1880s, an expert on the 1920s, which was pretty ugly, Kevin Boyle, the Art of Justice guy. If I could just get them to write an 8 to 10 page paper for me, they wouldn't have to do any research. They know all the stuff. Just write the paper, hand it off to me. We could have a first-class publication, and Wayne State wanted something to partner with us on. That became a reality really fast because everybody I asked said yes, without question. Automatically, they did well. There were a couple people, one fellow died. One person didn't come through, but other than that, they all said yes initially. So that became a wonderful part of that. In fact, we just got the notice that the Michigan Historical Society of Michigan awarded the book the State History Award, which is great. We're hoping for more beyond that. It's pretty cool. There were some wonderful publications out there. If you're interested, I'm sure the libraries have all of these. Sidney Fines is probably, no question about it, the most detailed, the finest research book on it. And it's basically about the week before, the week during, and the week after. And he goes into it, and it's about this thick. Kevin Boyle, who was one of his mentees, admitted that he hasn't even read it. It's not only thick as a book, it's thick to read. Okay, lots of details, but if you want to get the details, they're there. Tom Segru did Origins of the Urban Crisis, and he is now at the University of New York University, and that kind of starts in the 1920s and comes right up and tells us why it happened. Okay, what are the things behind it that got in there? Hubert Locke was a professor at Wayne who got tasked by the Mayor Kavanaugh to be an assistant police commissioner. He was a black guy who was complaining about the police, and Kavanaugh said, all right, you need to be there. You need to be in the middle of the department telling us how to fix it. And his insights are pretty incredible, and his book just got republished by Wayne State Press. There's also lots of other details. If you want to find them, the Kerner Report, which Johnson took and deposited in the file. He did, basically. It's exactly right. The Cyrus Vance Report, Kavanaugh's hour-by-hour report on what they were doing, psychologists, the Detroit Urban League, the Detroit Fire Department, insurance reports. There's all kinds of details out there if you want to. And then there's really cool stuff, sermons, all the pulpits in the city of Detroit. That was what they were talking about. And if those are written down and stored, they're a beautiful asset. Poems and letters that were published by the Broadset Press. Of course, the newspapers are there, and there are other oral histories that bring in this kind of stuff. So there's a great, vast bunch of knowledge if you really want to dig into that. We got 28 writers and one deceased writer to contribute to the book. Some of them were from oral histories. Some of them were the pages that I asked these guys to write, and they all came together very nicely.
And you've got copies of the autograph and
sell them. Mike, I do.
To sell tonight, that's right.
They're $40. I can only take cash and checks because I don't have a square, but okay. Or I am a square, I'm not sure. But I've got them here, but you can get them through our bookstore. You can get them through Wayne State University Press. You can get them through Amazon. There's basically 5 parts. There's the kind of the very early history, starting prehistory. Native Americans had slaves. We've had slaves in the Detroit area for a long time. Okay, there have been racial issues. Sometimes the issues are between the Czechoslovakians and the Poles. They'll tell you themselves. They used to get together and beat each other up. Okay, there have been issues like this of many kinds right up. That was kind of the early history up through World War II. Then we go into the 50s through the 60s, kind of narrow it down, and then we talk about the week. What happened that week, and this is pretty much how that worked out. I just want to kind of give you an idea of the scope of what the book covers, just in the one middle section. There are 2 great reports. First, there's a chronology, everything kind of minute by minute of exactly what happened if you want to see that. There are 2 wonderful reports. One was written and one's oral. One by the cop that busted the blind pig, and one by the son of the guy who owned the blind pig. And they were both there. The son had just gotten home from work. He was coming in to see the party that was going on. He knew the guys, and he couldn't get into the party because it was being busted. And the two of these guys tell different stories. One was a white Italian. The cop was a white Italian from the east side here. Tony, he's living down in Florida now. He's like all the Italian guys I grew up with at Austin. Wonderful guy, great sense of humor. The other guy also was in Florida. We had Bill McGraw looked all over for him and couldn't find him. He's homeless. He's always had a drug problem. But right after this happened, he wrote out his memories when he was a student at the University of Michigan. It wasn't the wars. I mean, it really was a point in his life when he was sober and clear, and he was able to put those down, and I kind of intersected those stories and how it happened. Hubert Locke, I mentioned him. He was the police commissioner, and he had a great story. The week before, and I should just give you a little idea if you haven't heard the story. Essentially, the police squad, the vice squad, out of the 10th precinct, was out on patrol, and they tried to break in or get into this blind pig. The idea was you send in, they had 2 black cops and 2 white cops. You send in one of the black cops, he'd buy a beer, and he'd stand around and chat for 10 minutes. And if he hadn't come out in 10 minutes, then the rest of the crowd went in and they busted the pig. And I didn't realize it. Blind pig is a Detroit term. A little bit of Chicago, a little bit of Cleveland, it's really a Detroit term. Most of the week that was going on, and the New York Times and the Washington Post are bringing in things, and the very first thing they say, they describe what a blind pig is to everybody else in the country. Because that's
just a blind pig. Yeah.
well, it's a term that actually goes back before Prohibition, and it has to do with, there's 2 explanations. One, it's a paid-off cop who's turning a blind eye. But there's also, it was an explanation for getting a beer legally during Prohibition. You would pay the owner of the building a dime to come in and see his blind pig, which he kept in the back room. And while you were there, you got a free beer. So those are the 2 explanations I've heard for how that happened. So it started in the 1890s related to gambling, but really solidified during Prohibition. Became a prohibition term.
So this is a bar called the Wyan.
This is a bar that doesn't have a license. And frankly, in the black community,
So it was like speakeasy?
yeah.
So there's no sign out front.
There's no sign out front. No, this was actually a printing company.
Yeah.
The building was a printing company on the first floor. The second floor was supposedly a political action group that was run by this gentleman, Mr. Scott, and he ran this political action group because the blacks had found that they finally had a voice. They got Kavanaugh elected, and other politicians were paying attention to that, and he could rally his troops and actually make a little money on it and pay the rent during election period. Middle of July, he wasn't getting any money, so he ran a blind pig out of it. So he was having a party, a big party, 80 guys, a couple of returning Vietnam veterans, and he had a pool table, and there was probably some gambling going on in the back room, and somebody was probably smoking a joint, but it was mostly beer and liquor that was going on there. And 12th Street at this time, this is 12th and Claremont is essentially where it was. 12th Street was the center of black economic life at that time. Back in the 20s through the 40s, it had been Hastings Street, Rivard, the area that was known either as the Black Bottom or Paradise Valley, kind of just to the east of Woodward Avenue, running from about Jefferson north to what's now the News Center area. That was kind of where blacks were allowed to live, frankly. They weren't allowed to live a lot of other places. There were deed restrictions on properties, which we had them in Grosse Pointe. Jews, blacks, and sometimes Irish, weren't allowed to live in certain places. So there were only a few places in the city that blacks could live. Conant Gardens was one, because Shubal Conant put no restrictions on his property. So there was a very well-to-do neighborhood up there. There was a place over on the east side where actually Hubert Locke was from, but the majority was in this Black Bottom Paradise Valley, and during the 50s, late 50s, it got leveled so that they could put in 375 and eventually, in the 60s, develop what is now Lafayette Park. Okay, so all of these people had to move. They didn't have much of a place to move to, so they all kind of generated over to what is now 12th Street. It had been a Jewish neighborhood. In fact, many of the businesses remain Jewish. There were about 50-50 black and Jewish businesses there. And during the day, it was where you went to buy your shoes. It was where you went to buy your pharmaceuticals. It's where you went to buy your furniture. It's where the dry cleaners were. The doctors were all there. That was kind of the life. 12th Street, Grand River, that was the place where blacks did their business and were welcome. In the evening, there were a number of clubs, mostly white-owned, that were there. It was real tough for blacks to get a license, a liquor license. And it kind of became a different nightlife. And in fact, it was known all over the city that if you wanted something, you could get it on 12th Street. Blacks, whites, suburbanites, and city people knew that 12th Street was the place to go. No matter what you wanted, you could find it there. As the clubs closed at 2 o'clock, hot summer night, people headed out to the street. There were a number of blind pigs around. These cops had been spending the evening trying to bust blind pigs and prostitutes, and they hadn't been successful. At 3 o'clock, their shift ended, and they just wanted one more shot at economy printing. They knew there was a party going on there. And in fact, the black officer, Officer Henry, who went on to a grand career in the DPD, got out of the car and kind of got in league with some women who he knew were going to the party. And with the women, he was able to get in. He tried to get in earlier in the night, he couldn't. He was able to get in that point. And he went in, he waited 10 minutes, the bus was on. Usually a bus to blind pig, there's 15 or 20 people. This was a major party. And oddly enough, Hubert Locke had been riding around with the Big Four. The Big Four was an intimidation unit that the Detroit Police Department used, mostly in black neighborhoods, but I was just talking with a guy the other day that they used it down in Delray against the white neighbors. But he had been riding around with this, and they had busted a blind pig the Saturday before and ran into 70 people, and they couldn't get them out fast enough. You know, the idea is get them out, get them into the station, and nobody cares. You know, people know what's happening, they kind of laugh, they say, I'll buy you cigarettes in prison, you know, and off they go. Sometimes they just wrote out tickets. Nobody got arrested, you know, except the guys who owned the place. Hubert Locke went back and said in the meeting on Monday morning, he said, we got to cover this, because if this happens again, this could be trouble. And by golly, he was right, because the week after it happened, big party, after 3 o'clock, all the cops went off their shift at 3 o'clock. After 3 o'clock, there were about 200 cops on duty in a city of 138 square miles. So with 200 cops, there wasn't much they could do. Once they busted the blind pig, they couldn't get people out of it fast enough. And as they were slowly getting people out, the crowds on the street, again, a hot summer night, people are hanging out, beer in hand, watching, laughing, and then they're watching the cops kind of hurrying people along, pushing people downstairs. The people on the street started getting angry. The cops started getting nervous, which meant they were pushing people faster, which means people were getting angrier, and eventually bottles and rocks started flowing, and that's when things got bad. The cops pulled out as fast as they could, went back to the station, told the lieutenant what was going on. He went over there to see what was up, got hit with a brick, pulled all of his troops out, which was counterintuitive to what had happened the year before. In 1966, there had been what they call a mini riot in Perchable. Very similar to what was going on, only with a little more instigation, a little bit more planning. The cops, it was middle of the afternoon, so there were lots of policemen on duty, especially since it was a ball game, there were a lot of guys available. They rushed them into Perchable, they shut it down really fast, very few injuries, very few arrests, not much damage, and they figured they had a hand on it. They figured they knew how to handle this kind of situation. In '67, they did exactly the opposite. They pulled all of the police out of the area and figured, let's just let them blow off some steam. Hopefully by morning, when the sun comes up, it all goes away. We know that didn't happen. Things just got worse from there. And frankly, it got worse in stages. There would be kind of a surge of looting and burning, and then it would go down, and then it would rise up again. And it was a real problem for people like Kavanaugh and Romney, who were on the site pretty quickly. They'd go out driving around and they wouldn't see anything going on. And they say it's winding down, we're in good shape. And then some reporters would come in off the street who had just been out there in a different part of the city, and they'd say, no, you're wrong, things are really getting worse. And that's where things escalated, and I don't want to go into the entire story here, but things went from there, and it de-escalated for the rest of the week.
So that's really my question. So how many days did the riot actually last for?
It depends on how you define it. Most people say 4 or 5. There was serious looting for the first 2 days, and a lot of arson, and the sniping got started. And right off the bat, Kavanaugh told his cops, no shooting. You just stand there and watch. And frankly, the looters couldn't figure out why they weren't being arrested. When they finally changed that order and started going in, they went in real hard. And oddly enough, instead of just giving them a ticket for shoplifting or a petty larceny, they were giving them tickets for entering without breaking, meaning that the building was already broken into, but they were going in and taking stuff, which is a felony, which means they had to get locked up, they had to go before a judge. So instead of just a misdemeanor, which would have made life pretty easy, they were getting charged with felonies, and there were 7,200 people arrested. There was no place to put them. This is a serious problem. And then the court system had to deal with it. And the court system was absolutely overwhelmed.
So when did the federal troops arrive?
Federal troops finally came on site first thing Tuesday morning. It's happened first thing, real early Sunday morning, late Saturday night, Sunday morning. We had National Guard finally came in on Monday, only because Kavanaugh really wanted to hold them off. Romney was right there, he wanted to offer them. Kavanaugh kind of held them off. We finally got National Guard in. And these were Air National Guard. Most of them were local guys, but then they brought in the guys, the training guys, who were up at Grayling. So they had to drive all the way in from Grayling. And most of these guys had never been into Detroit, had never seen a black person. It was maybe not the best troops to bring in, but they did. It was the only thing they had. And then finally, and the politics between Romney and Johnson were incredible. Remember that Romney had run for president the cycle before. Johnson was president, and he figured Romney was running again. And that got pretty ugly. It was a war of words in that Romney called and recommended that he get the troops, and his AG called back and said, you can't recommend it, you have to request it. And these little things went back and forth for a day. So had we got them in sooner, it would have gone a whole lot better.
So the National Guard was insufficient, and so it took another day till Tuesday.
Untrained, yeah. And finally, the 82nd and 101st came in, and they got in a Monday evening into Selfridge, and then finally got the word from Johnson just after midnight and deployed first thing in the morning. So,
And so did they, how quickly once they arrived,
curiously,
was order restored?
Curiously, they got assigned to the east side. There had been some looting and some arson up and down Mack, Perchable, and Jefferson, kind of in the from Mount Elliott out to Connor and a little bit further than that. And so they kind of got the best troops got assigned to the east side where not much was happening. The undertrained troops got to the worst part and sent in there. So
Is that downtown?
no, there were National Guard down guarding J.L. Hudson's, guarding Washington Boulevard, which had already been looted. They were downtown, but they basically went into the neighborhoods. They were based out of Central High School, if you know where that is.
So that's where most of the action.
That's where most of the action was. Yeah, and it kind of moved around a little bit.
I just wanted to share a little moment when you're bringing this up to the National Guard. At that time, I was 10. My father was a lieutenant on the midnight shift in Hamtramck. Hamtramck is a city surrounded by Detroit, 2.5 miles. And we were the safe haven. And what I remembered my dad being riot gear and things because the National Guard and the deployments could sit in this oasis of Hamtramck. We totally were closed off. We were totally safe. We honored curfew, and we were this hub. And where I grew up was one street over from Joseph Campo, which is the main drag that goes through Hamtramck. And it's a very wide street. And so all of these tanks and all of these deployments were on the next street over. But we felt secure. And my dad would just say, we're under control, we're safe here. And they would use Hamtramck as a pass-through. So you think of where this is, I think of when people aren't from the area, think of where Davison will lead to and end. And if you think of that kind of thing.
Well, and Highland Park was also pretty secure.
Yeah, and Highland Park. My dad just, happened to be on the night shift, and I remember him having a helmet on and stuff, but he didn't have to get involved. They were more to protect the perimeter of the oasis of Hamtramck, and the National Guard and everybody would come through and could stop, could respite, and then keep on going.
Is that because
So it's kind
Hamtramck
of
was at the
interesting.
time so ethnically unified? Is that why?
Well, but it was also its own city.
Yeah, we're our own city.
Yeah.
We're our own city, own
Yeah.
government, own police. We weren't a part of that, and so they just went locked down.
I see.
Well,
Yeah.
just to throw a couple of
Yeah.
other facts, I don't want to
Yeah.
get caught up in this, we'll be here all night, but
Yeah.
Newark had the same problem a week earlier. Newark had 3 times as many firemen and 3 times as many cops per square mile. They had half the deaths, they had half the injuries, and only 20% of the arrests. So I think we were understaffed at the time. Not only were we understaffed, they never used tear gas for a couple of reasons. The wind was blowing fairly good. It went from 8 to 10 knots at one point up to about 15 or 16 knots, which really was spreading the fires. That was a whole other problem. But it would have affected the innocent people as well as the rioters. Also, the Detroit Police Department, while they had 4,500 men, had about 400 gas masks and about 400 long guns. So that people were actually bringing their hunting rifles in with them to work when they came in as policemen to do this. So like arguably underprepared. But that's getting into the minutia. I don't want to dig too far into that. But there's wonderful stories to be told within those details. That people say, should it have been fixed quicker? Well, maybe. If you look at Newark, situation. But that was kind of a whole different thing. There is a whole debate about what do you call it, all right? And it's kind of changed, because when we grew up, as I grew up, probably most of you, how many of you grew up around here? I mean, we pretty much, yeah. It was the riots.
Yeah.
It was plural. I'm not sure why. It was one event, but it was always the riots, and that's just what we called it. And I did probably until I got back to college for my master's. There has been a real early on, there was a push in parts of the black community, more radical parts of the community, that they had taken back. This was a rebellion. They had pushed back. Not quite a revolution, but it was a rebellion. They had risen up against the man, against the police, who had been, the oppression of the police. There is no question. In fact, this article right here by Melville Joyce Boyd, who's a professor emeritus in African Studies, it's called "The Problem Was the Police." And we talk about that actually in the section before this. There's a guy who wrote an entire chapter on get tough policing throughout the United States, and particularly in Detroit. We weren't the worst. Philadelphia was absolutely the worst. Chicago was bad. Cleveland was bad. Detroit was in the middle. Boston a little bit better. There was varying degrees of how police dealt with these communities, but that was a huge problem. Little by little, rebellion got to be more and more accepted, and in fact, what Ken Coleman found out, he's a PR guy and a historian. He found out that if you talk to the people on the street, if you go down to 12th Street, the people who've been living there for the past 50 years, they said it was a riot. No question about it. They'll stand there and say it's a damn riot. If you go and you talk to the intellectuals, black or white in the universities, they're going to call it a rebellion. Okay? And if you read my book, you're going to hear every possible word: civil disturbance, uprising, chaos, melee. It was all of these. That's how we started our exhibit, is with a wall of definitions. And at one point during this, and arguably it lasted 7 weeks to get back to the end of your question, it wasn't until the Sunday following that they really started putting the police back in place of the National Guard, withdrawing the 101st and the 82nd. So the real heavy-duty burning and the real heavy-duty sniping was about 4 or 5 days long. And then and they didn't take the barricades down at the police department, and it became a fortress. That was about 2 weeks later. So depending on what you're looking at, that's the timeline that we're talking about there. So, yeah.
Questions. First, what is the difference between a riot and a rebellion?
In a riot, and this is an important distinction, in a riot, the blame is on the people who were taking stuff, the people who were breaking stuff. What are you doing? All right? They're doing the wrong thing. They're doing the bad thing. In a rebellion, they're doing it for a reason. They're angry. They're mad. They're pushing back. They're taking back. And there's got to be a reason for why they're doing that. And if you look at that problem, if you look at it from that angle, there was a reason. It was housing. It was education. It was transportation. It was jobs. It was the cops. Okay, so that if you look at them, there's a very good reason for using both those terms. So,
And you've got a police force of 5,000 with less than 100 plaques. It's an occupying force as far as the people are concerned.
yeah,
It really is.
yep.
And the second question, all the other cities, that same summer, is that when they had the same sort of?
There were about 50, over between 64 and 68, there were about 300 major things like that happened. Some of them had to do with Vietnam, some of them had to do with the environment, some of them had to do with women's issues, some of them had to do with drugs or the media. I mean, there were a lot of those, but about half of them were racial. And in 67, there were probably 40 or 45, some of them in places like Jackson, Michigan, that weren't major uprisings. But there were in 67, there were, geez, probably a good dozen that were big and pretty ugly. You know, Ferguson and bigger.
Was there something about the weather during that week?
Oh, it was god awful hot.
So that helped.
Well,
In a bad way.
in a bad way. Yeah, and it was windy, so that the fires were jumping. We've got the pictures. There was a gas station caught fire, and it started burning pretty hard, and the wind just lifted the flames right over the house next to it and burned the rest of the block. That house remained standing. And there was just a lot of that stuff. Entire blocks of stores getting burned out after they got looted. Of course, the liquor stores and pawn shops were the most popular because the pawn shops had the guns. The liquor stores had the liquor. But milk, people were going, because they knew the shops were going to be out of business, they were going and getting milk and cereal for their kids. There was a lot of that stuff going on too.
So was it like in the 80s, I mean, temperature-wise? Was it really hot?
Oh, no, it was during the day, it was up in the 90s, 92, 93, high humidity, ugly July in Detroit. And with the wind, it was bad that way too, and the barometer was really low, so that all the smoke was hugging the land. I mean, and everybody in Detroit smelled smoke. We did a word cloud with our oral histories, and the most popular word was Hudson's, because that's where everybody started. Detroit was such a great place, we used to go down to Hudson's for Christmas. Okay? Everybody said that of a certain age. Okay? So Hudson's was the most, but the other two words were smoke second and tank third, because that's what everybody smelled, and that's what even if they didn't see fire, even if they didn't see any guns, they saw the tanks and they saw smelled the smoke.
How many civilians lost their life and versus cops?
Officially 43. But that's been argued ever since. Some people put it over 200, which that didn't happen. But the coroner's office was in charge of those numbers. And I know of at least a couple of cases, a guy carrying stuff out of his house has a heart attack. His house is burning, so he has a heart attack. That's not riot related. Two guys are trying to steal the same television or something, and one shot the other one. That was not riot related, and I'm not sure why.
How is that
I
not
couldn't.
related? How is that?
Silly disturbance.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that worked out. So the official number is 43. It was probably closer to 60, maybe even 70. It was south of 100, whatever it was. People were saying that bodies were floating down the Detroit River, or bodies were getting dumped into the sewers. And the Free Press actually sent people into the sewers to try to find that out. They never found any of that. So, not to say now, two guys died in the basement of the store they were looting. It caught fire. They didn't get out. They died down there. Those were riot related. So where that line came, I'm not sure.
And what about police or soldiers?
It was about half and half in
really?
the deaths. Yeah. Well, I take that back. In the injuries, the deaths, we lost 2 firemen, one to a gunshot and one to an electrocution. When he was trying to put out a fire, we lost 1 fireman and 1 National Guardsman. So out of those were the deaths. The black-white ratio was much closer than a lot of people would have guessed. It was white storekeepers shooting blacks. It was blacks shooting white storekeepers. One guy tried to defend his store with a saber, and he didn't last long. So that was sour. But there were also white looters. There were people coming. There were Ohio license plates on 12th Street. There were people coming into this to get into the party.
Oh my God.
Okay, yeah. We think it's silly, but that's what they were doing. So we've got pictures of white looters. Most of the snipers who were arrested were white. Okay, these are stories that we've got in the exhibit, we've actually got on tablets and Mythbusters. You know, things that everybody has heard. And the stories you hear, one guy, I was at a talk like this, and one guy raised his hand and said, my dad was telling me how the 101st Airborne parachuted into 12th Street. That never happened. They came in by bus. Okay? But that's what his dad told him. That's what history in his household was. That's what his memory of 67 was. And that's as important to the historical record, whether it's true or false, as what really happened. And that's why we're trying to get all these stories, and we're trying to bust these myths. In the exhibit, we've got Mythbusters on the tablets. It's all facts and people's remembrances of what went on. Keenan Wyan, who's a great storyteller, was saying, you know, we were sitting on my grandma's front porch, and these guys were coming by with boxes of food they had taken. And they came up and they said, Mrs. Wyan, here's some food. And she said, get that stuff away from me. It's never right to do wrong. And the kid's sitting there saying, Grandma, I'm hungry. You know, I don't have any food. And wonderful stories like that. Kathleen Curtis, which is right down at the bottom, she's a waitress down at Greenfields on Woodward, when things were going bad, and she couldn't get home because the buses weren't running. And it's a wonderful story. I won't even give it away, but you can read it. You don't have to buy the book. It's on the website. It's an oral history. Wonderful story of a black taxi driver saying, I'll get you home. Just, there was a lot of good stuff. It's part of what we got into the exhibit, and just to move on here, we did get a lot of great photos and a lot of great films from people, so yeah.
How long is your exhibit going to be?
About 3 years, at least 2, but we're hoping the interest has been incredible.
And there's a wonderful tour, you're part of it, on cspan.gov. The week of the 50th anniversary in July, they did that C-SPAN special, and it's available on their website.
Yep.
So hopefully you can get down and see the exhibit, but you can actually tour the entire exhibit.
And remember
online.
The museums are free.
Yeah.
Parking $7, but it's $7 at Wayne, it's $7 across the DIA, but the museums are free, so come and see us. Anyway, so we did put the exhibit together. That's basically what I do for a living, so I had to insist we did an exhibit. And in fact, we did. We spent more money in that space, about 10 times more money than we ever had before. And it's laid out, all of these people told us kind of what we had to do. This is our Doorway to Freedom, which is our Underground Railroad exhibit. So that kind of takes you from 1830s up to the 1890s, and then we pick up right across the hall about 1890, 1900, and we get you up to 1960. Now, this exhibit gets seen by third graders. We were pretty sure third graders weren't going to go in there, so we had to leave this open hallway up the center, which was real nice because it kind of introduces you. We've got a bunch of pictures of, Pat Boone and Mick Jagger. You know, that's how the 60s were. Khrushchev and Kennedy. 60s was just contrast after contrast after contrast. My folks had to think the floor was moving. If you know, when you were an adult at that period, there was so much going on. So we try to get people kind of into the 60s going down here. Then we start by asking, what do you call it? We start right off with that. We've got a touch screen with about 4 different questions on it. You know, what do you call it? Do you remember it? So we get some demographic data. Remember it clearly, don't remember it. It was just a kid, didn't live here. Just to kind of balance that out. And then we ask the same questions down at the other end and see if anything has changed. And frankly, it has. It's kind of cool to see that that's changed. But we get in here, we've got a little thing about the 66 riot, but it more has to do with how the media covered it. How the media presented it to the people of Detroit is an important part of the story. What did they call it? What did they call the people around the street? What did they call the interpretation in 66? So that both introduces people to 66 and also the media angle on it. We get you up into the 60s, and of course, 1967, Detroit was at a really good spot, if you were white, of course. But for the city government, we were the Olympic, the U.S. Olympic bid. We went to 68, but we became that was us. We were building some great cars. We were riding a real wave and building some beautiful buildings. There was great new civic center and things were going up. 60s in Detroit was a pretty neat thing. Okay, so how did we get from this wonderful position that we were in with a progressive mayor who was getting blacks onto the police force, albeit slowly, was getting blacks into the government. Things were changing. How did we get beyond that? We then take you into a basic living room. Could have been a living room anywhere in southeastern Michigan. And this is important, and I do want to get through this, and then I'll run through the rest of the project and get you out of here. Probably run out of time. Yeah, okay, so we don't want to belabor this. But one of the things that happened right off the bat, because of Perchable, the mayor, Damon Keith, a couple of the pastors called around to the TV stations and asked them to put a lid on it, and the radio stations and that kind of thing. And they did. They didn't report this. The newspapers didn't actually get it out till the next day. The television radio stations didn't cover it till about 6 or 7 o'clock. Remember back then there were 3 TV stations and CKLW.
Yeah, right.
CKLW got to it first. They put a camera on their Riverside studio at about 2 o'clock, but nobody in Detroit was watching CKLW, okay? Bernie Harwell in the broadcast booth at Tiger Stadium was told specifically, don't say anything about the smoke. Okay, they were running the Motown Review down at Fox, and they finally came in about 9 o'clock. Martha Reese had to get up and say, we need to go home, and go right home. You know, don't stop, don't go to the bar, just head for home.
But at the Tiger game, they announced where not to drive as you left the game, too.
As they did have cops there steering people away from it, because it was relatively close. So the way people found out about this was in their living rooms. They were busy watching on TV, and we kind of did it. Those of us who are old enough remember Buana Don or George Perot. We've actually got some old George Perot footage there. Or Kroger ads where chicken is 39 cents a pound. That's what you were watching on Sunday morning. You weren't watching what was going on. You were getting a phone call, and we've got a phone with a rotary dial that you get, it rings, and you can pick it up. You got somebody on the other end saying, I can't get a hold of mom and dad, I'm going over there to keep the kids inside. Things are getting weird over on 12th Street. That's how people were finding out. They were finding out from neighbors walking by the front of their home. 99% of the people in Detroit found out from their friends and their family. So important part of the story. Then we take you out. In fact, here's the living room. We also, while you're watching this, we've got an interactive map that kind of shows how the fires were building, where the snipers were, how the army was moving in. We then get you down on the street, and we've got 2 different stores that we go, a shoe store and a record store, and they actually do some really cool projection stuff. You watch them get broken into, you watch them get looted, you watch them get burned. So we get you down there, and it wasn't frantic. Except for the sound of breaking glass, most of these people were out there just because it's what they were doing. There were so many stories of kids. One story in the news, a kid went into a dry cleaner, just grabbed a whole armload of clothes, and ran out with everybody else because his buddy was doing it. He got about halfway down the block, he realized they were all adult clothes. What the hell am I going to do with these clothes? And he just dropped them. I mean, it was that kind of mentality that was going on at this time. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't, there was some revolution stuff going on. There were a lot of drunk people, but it wasn't as frantic as maybe you had imagined. So that's kind of what we represent there.
Because of the news blackout, was the reason that there was a general consensus or an agreement amongst the leaders of these outlets that they weren't going to broadcast the news, was because they didn't want to instill fear?
Kavanaugh thought he could put a lid on it, like he had the year before.
I see.
Yeah.
In other words, just by not reporting it, it might go away.
Yeah. Don't get everybody else out on the street at the same time. So it didn't work. They finally reported it. And then the newspapers did a really good job, and the TV stations, of getting people in there. In fact, we've got a wonderful picture that the news actually, or the Free Press, got an armored personnel carrier from Chrysler, who was making them. Put helmets on their guys. One of the guys was an intern at U of D. And they went in, Ira Rosenberg was a photographer, and they sent these 3 guys right into the riot zone in this armored personnel carrier to try to get the story. Izzy Rosenberg got some great pictures. Because the tank was so important, we decided we were going to put one in there. And this is probably the thing that in all our focus groups got the most pushback. And my favorite conversation were 2 women sitting next to each other, both about the same age, both black. And the one woman said, you cannot put a tank in there. That the tank represents oppression, it represents the police force, it represents occupying forces. You can't do that. And the woman next to her said, well, golly, that's the very reason you gotta put a tank in there. Okay, that's what everybody remembers, and that's the gut visceral reaction that everybody had. If you skip that, you're skipping a really important part. But we didn't want to make it ugly. We didn't want to really freak people out.
Your floor wouldn't support it either.
And we actually own one.
Yeah, Fort Wayne, right?
Yeah.
But this is so cool on the other side.
So yeah, so we took as you first see it, it looks real. And then as you walk around behind it, it becomes a theater. And we had a couple of artists do a very incredible animation based on our oral histories about what people were seeing related to tanks. Little kids coming to the window and seeing a tank. A cop who's getting shot at by a sniper and watching a tank just blow the side off of the building, killing a 4-year-old girl, by the way. There's a bunch of wonderful, poignant stories that needed to be told, and so we told them in a really interactive way there. It's a pretty powerful piece. And then behind that, we kind of talk about the government reaction, the politics that were going on, the timeline, the incarceration rate, how the courts were overwhelmed, the hospitals were overwhelmed, the news outlets were overwhelmed. We discuss all this stuff and how it affected other people. Japanese or Chinese American who had a restaurant down on 12th Street. He never came back. Chaldean Family that owned a party store down there. And Dad's down there with the uncles and the shotguns keeping the store from getting looted. I mean, there were a lot of other people involved besides the cops and the people in the neighborhood. So we had to tell those stories. On the other side, we talked about the Elders Motel incident. Has anybody seen Detroit? Yeah, what'd you think?
I thought it was interesting.
Yeah?
I mean, knowing the history from taking history course in high school,
Okay.
it made a little more sense than I thought of California than kids in California who knew nothing about Detroit and the riots thought. So, I guess about perspective.
It's pretty visceral from what I've heard. They got the history pretty close to right, about 90% right based on people I've talked to. I hear the character development, because of how Catherine Bigelow does movies, it goes really fast. So the character development isn't there. I haven't seen it. I don't need to see it. Thank you. I've been living there for 3 years. So it was the worst part of the riot. It's when a group of Detroit policemen killed 3 young teenagers. Whether they had the right to do so or should have done so, read the stories. There are lots of stories out there. In fact, Danielle McGuire's got a book coming out about it. John Hershey put out a book about it. There's a lot of details out there. The newspapers have lots of stuff. We do have the story told on the tablet, but we tell just the basic story there. Because I don't think that's the important story. This is bad. This is a really, really bad thing that happened. But for every bad thing that happened, there were a ton of good things happening. People pulling invalids out of burning buildings because they couldn't get out. The story of Kathleen Curtis and the taxi driver. People in Ann Arbor loading trucks full of milk because they knew that the people in the neighborhood wouldn't have milk. Churches, all of the churches in southeastern Michigan got together as food banks, all coordinated by the Episcopal Cathedral down there in Woodward, and all this food was getting back into the neighborhood until people could get up and running. And frankly, some of the stores never reopened. There was about 40% of the stores, 50% of the stores were uninsured. 40% of the stores were underinsured, only 10% of them were fully insured. So a lot of those guys just walked away and never came back. And the people I know that live in that neighborhood, that's the part they most hate, is that once this all happened, nobody came back and fixed it.
So just out of crazy curiosity, I mean, here we are 50 years later, are there any remaining burned out storefronts that never got repopulated since the riot?
No, they've all been torn down. There was one right across the street from the Blind Pig. It was there until about 8 months ago. And I went by 2 weeks later and it was gone.
But you go down that
Because
stretch.
there's a neat park right across the way, which I'll get to.
You go down 12th Street now, there's no businesses at all except
No.
that
There's
there's
a
strip
new-
mall about 3 blocks
A
down.
new
right?
strip mall,
Yeah.
and there's a couple of churches that are doing some community activity. One of the cool things, and let me just go real quickly, we then take you the next 50 years. We talk about what happened immediately after. New Detroit got formed, Focus Hope got formed, Operation Get Down, East Side Organization, a grassroots organization, got started. They're still around. All of these organizations, the churches, that's when the Shrine of the Black Madonna, already an established church, that's when it changed its name and its focus. A lot of changes went on. We talk about where we've gone since then, you know, the ugly days of the 80s. But we forget that the ugly days of the 80s were when the Forbes and Illich started fixing theaters. You know, while Hudson's was busy closing for lack of business, there were people actually putting money into the city at the same time. So you can't say just the ugly 80s. There were some good things that were going on. 90s started getting better. Of course, the car business was great. We got to 2008 and it was boom, all right? And then, you know, it's the roller coaster that is Detroit. And now things are doing pretty well. We got the Q line downtown is cool. Hipsters, Cass Corridor is hip. It's like weird. What the hell? That's not what I grew up with, but it's really neat. But you go 5 blocks in one direction and you're in the pits. And if you don't live on the Q line, it ain't doing you any good. Transportation is worse than it was then. I would argue education is worse than it was then, although I've talked to some parents who say it's not, but arguably it is. Employment within the city is a real problem. Peter Hammer's got a great chapter in the book about where we are economically and what he calls spatial racism, which I think would also be called spatial classism. It's gone beyond race. There's a whole separation there that's really developed.
So perhaps one of the risks of everything, you know, going so well now is that it'll bind us to those bind us to some of the same kinds of pressures and challenges and discriminatory practices that led us to 67.
Absolutely. Which is why we do talk about it in that section, but then we actually put in a section after that for 2 reasons. One, has anybody been to the Memphis Museum, the Civil Rights Museum, in the motel where Martin Luther King was killed? It's an I haven't been. One of my cohorts went, and she said it was an incredible museum, and it builds. It's like a movie building to a finale, and the finale is incredibly moving. And you walk out the door, and you're in the gift shop, and it's like, you know, weeping to tchotchkes, and it just killed her. And she said, we can't do that. We got to give a place where people can sit down and think about this, and maybe talk about it. And that's probably the best thing that's happened is people are talking, strangers in the exhibit are talking about their experiences, talking about where Detroit is. And we also have created a place where all of these partners who do stuff, who have these difficult conversations, who get people together and talk about, you know, the fact that, yeah, part of the city's better. I'd argue it's more than that 7.2 or whatever they're talking about. There are a lot more neighborhoods that are pretty stable. But maybe if you say it's 40 square miles, it's good. That means there's 100 miles that are still bad, and we can't let those go, and we try to get people involved. This is the looking forward part. You know, if you really love the city and you really think there's a future for it, then get involved, do something. And it doesn't have to be having difficult conversations. It can be teaching an adult to read, it can be planting trees, it can be getting involved in urban gardening, it can be helping clean up a neighborhood, but getting people who really are interested involved and giving the opportunity. We're not going to tell anybody to do it. But there's cards on the wall you can take. There's URLs on a scrolling calendar that tell you of events that are related to 67, related to discussions on equality, on diversity. If you want to get involved in that stuff, it's seminars that are going on at all the universities around. If you want to get involved, it's all on our website, it's all on the wall. There's an opportunity for you to get that information before you leave. And there's also an opportunity to just sit down and think about it. Talk about it. Some books there if you want to do some research. We give you the opportunity to do that. So that's kind of the final part of this. Moving on real quickly, we've got all the teacher tools on the website, so that they can prepare their kids before they come, talk to their kids after they come. If they're not coming, they can work through lesson plans and that kind of thing. But the placemaking is probably one of the neatest things that we did outside of our walls. Here's economy printing. This is the cleanup afterwards. So we're about 2 weeks after the whole thing started. And there's a park right here, a park that has playground equipment in it. And that park, once they started tearing all this stuff down, that park became Gordon. It had always been called Gordon Park. It's named after, I think, a World War I vet who never actually lived in Detroit. So I'm not sure why they called it Gordon Park. But it became a park, and then it got a little long in the tooth. And part of the commemoration was getting the city, and they were interested, to come back. And they talked with us. They got us on board. They got PNC Bank on board. The city's Parks and Rec department got involved. And then they went into the city, into the neighborhood, and they talked to the 2 or 3 churches that are still there. There's another organization, I think it's called Friends Forever or something. It's a bunch of guys who grew up in that neighborhood who still live there. And they have, after-school programs and things like that that they do. And talk to these different people who still live in the neighborhood and said, what do you want? What do you want your park to look like? We're not going to tell you what your park's going to look like. And so they went in and they redid it. There's a stage area. There's a brand new playscape down at the far end. There's just places to sit. And we were involved in getting the historic marker up. There was nothing before that ever said, this is where the worst riot in U.S. history started. So, well, that's not actually true. Some of the draft riots during the Civil War were worse. But the worst racially driven 20th century riot was started right here. So that's what we did. We also had a lot of marketing and fundraising. I won't go into this. This is a really important part. If you're running Bob Burry, he'd be happy to talk to you about this. We had to raise $4 million in order to make this whole thing work. And they did an incredible job. And it was the first time that we got any money out of the Ford Foundation. And the Ford Foundation has started turning their attention back toward Detroit, but they hadn't looked at us. And we were finally able, frankly, a lot of people were interested in this. A lot of people wanted to help the diversity issue, the equality issue, but nobody wanted to be the first person to jump into the pool. And the Ford Foundation was. And once they did, then the Kellogg and the Kresge's and all of these other organizations got together and really helped us make that goal. And we have put together a model, not to go too deep into it, but we put together a model on how we think this should be done. Because all those other cities that we were talking about earlier that did it around the country, nobody is having a commemoration like Detroit. Nobody is talking about this like Detroit. Maybe because some of them are still suffering it. We're talking Charleston and in Ferguson and Baltimore and Chicago and Milwaukee and Cleveland. All of those places had racial problems in the 60s. 66 and 67 mostly. But they're not doing anything about it. Newark is the only place that has had any kind of approach like this, and all they did was an exhibition. And one of the professors put out a book. Nobody has attacked it in such a broad scheme like we have, so we're actually put together this model, suggesting the best way to approach this, and we're taking it off to various conferences of museum professionals and suggesting this is the way to do it. It's been successful, it's been very well accepted, and frankly, if you get that many voices coming into the conversation, you're going to get it right. It will be right if you do it right. So that's it. Sir, you had a question?
Well, I think you just answered it.
Oh, okay.
Where are you getting, through whatever source, people from outside other cities
To understand this.
questioning, understanding it, and how did you, knowing the background,
Yeah.
or
Well, we have kind of put together this model, and there are places. Ferguson has called, Baltimore has called, and we're sending this out and suggesting this is the way to do it. Paris has called. How do you deal with the embedded racial issues that you got, and how do you get people talking about it? Getting a seminar together is not going to get the right people in the room. Getting people into a church is great, but not everybody goes to church. So it's organizations like the DIA, like the Wright Museum, having the symphony do something. Just kind of brings it down to a level that everybody can talk about it. Everybody can get these conversations going in the bar afterwards or in the coffee house afterwards. And I think that's an important part. You can't sit them down across the table from each other where it's going to inevitably be a confrontation. And as I said, people are just standing around an exhibit talking.
Great.
Come see it. Did I say admission's free?
Well, Joel's got books with him. Anybody have any other questions? I'll tell you one story, and I'm sorry I already spoke too much. I went to the World's Fair a month later, and I had a University of Detroit sweatshirt on, and 3 women came up to me and said, "You from the city of Detroit?" I said, "Yes." I was born in Bon Secours, but I grew up at Harper and Neff. And my parents had saved for 3 years for us to go to the World's Fair. And the woman said, "Did they burn your house?" I said, ma'am, the city is very big. It was only a very small part of the city, but, you know, everybody thinks it was the entire city of Detroit.
Yeah, well, and it did affect the way people
Well, it did,
thought about
yeah.
the city. It's been 50
I still remember
years.
that, like it was yesterday. It was like, did they burn your house?
That's an interesting story I haven't heard.
Any
And
other comments
those
or
are-
any questions?
Those are the stories we want in our oral history.
It's only a sentence.
All you gotta do is call, 3
Yeah, I will.
minutes on the
Yes,
phone,
you're right,
okay?
But he's got the books with him, and the exhibit. You go on C-SPAN and take a look at it, go down and see it firsthand. It's incredible.
Better live.
Thank you, it sure is. Oh, and there's cookies and water if you want to stay and talk afterwards. We're not in a rush to get out of here. Thank you all. Hopefully see you at the other program. Thank you.